Dealbreaker, a Tavern Tale story, written by Samantha Flanagan, narrated by Stephen Ragsdale. The tavern was lit with cheer and joy. The usual patrons had stopped by after their long hours of the day and were seeking a bit of comfort in the good company of others. Games were being played. Old friends gathered and shared jokes and laughter. Pool sharks hung around the billiards table, edging just about anyone who eyed a cue. The jukebox sat quietly in the corner. And over behind the counter, Katina was keeping a close watch on everything going on around her. It was a pretty typical Friday night for the tavern. Katina started wiping down the bar when several figures approached her, dressed in dark cloaks. It was hard to see their faces, but a glimpse of their appearance beneath the cloaks showed patches of green scales and yellow eyes.
"Greetings, Katina,"
one of the dark-cloaked figures hissed. Katina looked up at the group and sighed. "Looking for a drink or the back room again?" she said as she placed her hands on her hips. The figure in the dark cloak bowed.
"The Brotherhood of Scales thanks you for your hospitality, and yes, we would like some drinks and to use the back room for our gathering,"
the figure said. Katina reached down behind the bar and pulled out an old key and placed it on the counter. "You know the drill. Keep the noise down, no hurting anyone here, no hurting anyone that you bring here, and do not destroy my property. The back room is my private room that is rented out to others. Speaking of which, payment up front, as per usual," she said sternly. The cloaked figure reached into their cloak and pulled out a small roll of bills and placed it on the counter. Katina reached out and took the roll, carefully counting it before placing it in her pocket. "I'll be around in a few to get your orders," she said. The figure snatched the key, and though she could barely see their face, Katina knew they were grinning.
Of course, friend. The Brotherhood of Scales is always good on its word,"
the figure said. Soon it turned to its companions, whispered something, and all of them scurried off to the back room. The door slammed shut, and a faint locking noise could be heard. Katina stood by and shook her head.
"Lizards,"
she muttered to herself as she went back to wiping down the counter. The door swung open and old Charles stumbled in. His face was red, his beard gray and scraggly, and he carried a smile on his face as he eyed Katina at the bar. "Kay, my sweet, did we get that delivery on Thursday?" Charles asked as he swayed over to the counter and sat down. Katina looked up at him and only smiled. She reached down and pulled out a bottle of Chardonnay from under the bar. "Kept it safe for you," she said as she placed the bottle on the counter. Katina grabbed a corkscrew from her pocket and popped the cork out, and Charles was soon given a glass of wine. He took a sip and sighed in relief. "Ah, you're such a doll, Kay," he said as he took another sip. Katina only smiled as she turned away to assist others with their drink orders. Charles took another sip and blinked a few times. "Kay," he said. Katina quickly turned to look at Charles, then turned back at the people at the bar.
"Excuse me, please,"
she said as she turned back and walked over to Charles. Charles started to sway a bit at the bar.
"Charles, feeling all right?"
Charles looked up at Katina. The smile had faded, and a serious look painted his face and filled his eyes. "Down along the rocky shore some make their home. They live on crispy pancakes of yellow tide foam," Charles muttered. Katina looked at him with concern. Charles' gaze soon turned to his glass. "Some in the reeds of Black Mountain Lake, with frogs for their watchdogs all night awake," Charles said as he gulped down the rest of his wine. Katina reached over to Charles and carefully slipped the wine glass from his hand. "Maybe you should lie down," Katina said as she placed the wine glass on the counter. Charles stared at the countertop, his eyes blinking widely before looking back up at Katina. The smile returned to his face. "Another glass, dear," he said with a hearty smile. Katina placed her hand on the wine bottle.
"What was that poem you just said?"
Charles looked confused. His eyes wandered from left to right and all around, and finally landed on the wine glass. "Oh, right. Something in the air reminded me of that. I can't remember where I heard it from, but I know of it. Just a feeling, he said, still smiling. Katina squinted her eyes before pouring Charles another glass of wine. That can't be good, she said as she turned around and continued assisting the other patrons at the counter. The temperature in the air around the bar dropped as the wind blew in from the cracks of the door. The door suddenly swung open. A young man with short brown hair in a black jacket with a dark purple scarf rushed into the tavern, and just as fast as he came in, he slammed the door shut and locked it. The man then rushed up to the counter, pushing people out of the way. "Excuse me, pardon me. Oh, love your hat. Out of the way," he said as he squirmed his way to the counter right in front of Katina. Objections were made by those around him. "Kat, I got a favor to ask you," the man said as he quickly turned his head back towards the door and then back to Katina. "Carl, what did you do this time?" Katina asked in a serious tone. Carl grinned and shrugged. "If someone comes here asking for me, I'm not here," Carl said as he quickly spun around and ran for the bathroom doors. Katina stretched out her arm. "No, wait. Carl, you owe me an explanation right now." A scream of a woman from the bathroom shortly echoed through the tavern, along with a hard slapping sound that would make any man's flesh crawl. Katina leaned on the counter and placed her hand over her face, slowly dragging it down.
Oh, that idiot,
she said as she stood up. Unknowingly to many of the patrons in the tavern at that moment, the air started to thin slightly. A fresh smell of pine and wet soil drifted slowly through the air. The wooden tables and chairs started to slowly hum, as if life was trying to breathe back into them. Tiny threads of grass poked through the floorboards. Katina soon realized something was wrong with the tavern as she placed a tray on the counter with several bottles and noticed a blue butterfly landed right next to her on the counter. She then took notice of the air and the smell. "Oh no," she said to herself. It started with a small group at one of the booths. One of the people fell onto the ground and passed out. It was not an uncommon occurrence, but then more people soon found themselves unconscious on the floor. Glasses got knocked over and chairs were tipped. The lively atmosphere soon turned into a quick panic, and then silence, as one by one folks around slipped into a comatose state. Katina struggled against whatever was causing this as she fell onto the counter, struggling to keep her eyes awake. Her shoulders quickly felt like they were being dragged down by a heavy weight. She rolled onto the floor behind the counter. To her left was the old wooden bat that she kept, and she could see little flowers starting to wriggle their way through the wood.
God damn it,
she grunted to herself as she rolled over onto her stomach. Her entire body was screaming at her to rest as the prospect of a nap and the relief it would bring flooded through her head. Pushing those thoughts out of her head, she grabbed the bat and used it to push herself up from the ground and onto her knees. As she looked up, she saw Charles still sitting upright, looking down at her with a serious look on his face again, unaffected by whatever was going on. "Up the airy mountain and down the rushy glen," Charles started. The entrance door that Carl bolted shut started to rattle. The wood started to creak, and the bolt started to ring. "We daren't go hunting for fear of little men," Charles said. The door started to bend as the bolt slipped off and onto the floor. The door remained upright. The door then shimmered a bit as the wood seemed to part sideways, as if it were made of cloth. A cool forest breeze crept in, and from the parted door stepped in a tall figure. He was roughly 8 feet tall. He had the face of a goat with curved horns and a pink nose. His fur was a light blue color with deep emerald green eyes. He wore a dark blue robe with a deep purple cloak that stretched all the way down to his hooves, and his long fingers caressed a knotted old tree root used as a walking staff. He looked around at the scene and gave a weak smile. He then turned his gaze towards Charles, who didn't seem to notice the figure at the doorway. "Charles, my old friend," the goat man said as he slowly approached. Charles jerked his head up and turned towards the goat man, who was now towering over Charles. "Ah, you," Charles said as he pointed at the goat man. "I won your games long ago." The goat man smiled. "Yes, you did. And what fun we had, my old friend," the goat man said with a smile as he placed his hand on Charles's shoulder. Charles flicked the goat man's hand away from his shoulder. "So we have no more business between you and I." The goat man nodded. "Very true, my friend. I am here on other matters." Katina grunted. She struggled to push herself up from her knees. The goat man's ears flickered with curiosity, and he turned his head and looked down at Katina with a surprised look on his face. He tilted his head, squinted his emerald eyes, reached into his robe to pull out little gold-framed glasses, and placed them gently on the brow of his nose. "Curious. I didn't expect to see a hellspawn here. And somewhat resistant to my spell. This world is indeed full of surprises," the goat man said peacefully. "Leave Kay out of this. She's got no business with you," Charles said. The goat man nodded. "Yes, indeed true. I have no business with her as well," the goat man confirmed.
Right,
Katina said as she slowly stood up using the bat as a walking stick and made her way to the counter before reaching out and grabbing onto the bar, pulling herself up.
"You're looking for..."
Katina said as she blinked a few more times, then started to lean over as the sleep spell was starting to get to her. "No, my dear. This simply will not do," the goat man said promptly, and with a wave of his hand the spell ended, and Katina's eyes shot open. She jolted herself up and was now more alert than ever. The sudden relief of the weighted feeling disappearing was enough to make her heart race. She staggered for a moment and composed herself. The goat man smiled as he wrapped his hands around his walking staff. "You held on long enough, my dear. Now, let us have a proper conversation," the goat man said. Katina clenched her fist and took a deep breath.
You come into my place. You place a spell on my patrons without their consent. You ruined my door. This does not make you a good guest in my establishment,"
Katina said. The goat man was taken aback a bit at this statement. "My dear, I can assure you that I intend to honor the code of hospitality. My deepest apologies. 'Twas my understanding that a public house such as this would not have such an owner, and therefore could be freely interacted with," the goat man said.
"Wrong," Katina said as she pulled out the roll of bills from her pocket. "That room over there is my private living space," Katina said as she pointed to the door that led to the back room. "I rent it out to others, and that makes them my guests in my place. I can assure you, open that door and you'll find 3 people passed out as well, like everyone else. And, since you are here looking for someone, I would like to go over the terms of whatever agreement they had with the possibility of a revision, seeing as you have affected my guests in my space," Katina said.
The goat man said as he stroked his scruff under his chin and furrowed his eyebrows. "Pretentious and arrogant," the goat man mumbled to himself before he spoke up. "Those are quite the demands, but my magic would have affected your guests as well," he said as he bowed his head in thought. After a moment, he looked back up at Katina with a subtle grin. "Very well. In the spirit of hospitality, I shall agree to these terms." The sound of a door slowly creeping open, followed by footsteps, interrupted the conversation as the 3 turned their heads to see Carl tiptoeing over the sleepy patrons. He suddenly froze as his eyes met theirs. He was holding what looked to be a ceramic jug with a cork stuck in it. A puckish smile grew on Carl's face. "Mr. E!" Carl said in a charismatic tone. "Glad to see you, old chap. Just the man I was looking for." Mr. E smiled. "Carl, my future grandson-in-law. I was looking for you, too."
Here I was, thinking you'd gotten cold feet before the wedding.
The wedding? Katina said as her cold gaze shifted between Mr. E and Carl. Carl, for a brief moment, looked towards Katina with a nervous look in his eyes, but quickly washed it away and replaced it with confidence as he looked back at Mr. E. Now, Mr. E, I wouldn't get cold feet. Why, I was just reminiscing about my old favorite places and saying farewell to my old friends such as Kat and Charles, Carl said as he gestured towards Katina and Charles respectively. Carl held up the jug. Why, I won't even need this old thing, but I figure I will take it out of hiding as I will no longer need it, and share it with my good friends before I go. Carl placed the jug on the counter. Mr. E tilted his head with a curious look at the jug.
What is it, my friend?
Mr. E asked. Oh, it's nothing. Just a small brew I made and stored it here. A little rye, some yeast, water, honey, and some herbs, Carl said as he uncorked the jug. An herbal aroma gently filled the area around it, and had a soft, sweet smell with a hint of flowers and honey. Mr. E carefully closed his eyes and took a small sniff. His ears flickered a bit, and a smile grew on his face.
Well now, Carl, it would appear that I am in violation of the rules of hospitality, as informed by one of your friends here,
Mr. E said as he opened his eyes and looked towards Katina.
In the spirit of friendship and hospitality, how about we discuss the terms of our deal over a nice drink of your special brew?
Mr. E said as he sat down at the bar. A cunning grin shined on Carl's face. Oh, Mr. E, this brew here is not of high quality. It's not worthy of you. I'm sure there are far superior beverages in the land of the Fae that you can introduce me to when we arrive. A celebration, a toast to good friendship, and a prosperous future, Carl said as he corked the jug. Mr. E slowly reached out with his long fingers and carefully placed his hand on top of the jug.
Now, Carl, let's not be so hasty. We'll have plenty of time to celebrate and make joy in the land of the Fae. Come, sit beside me and let us have a drink here.
Carl lifted his hands up and smiled. Well, if you insist, future grandfather-in-law, then I shall, Carl said as he sat down at the bar. Carl looked at Katina. A couple of glasses, please, barkeep. One for me and one for my friend. Katina gave a smile that was peppered with sarcasm as she reached for a couple of small glasses and placed them in front of the two. Charles had slumped over at this point, but his gaze was still fixed on Mr. E. Carl picked up the jug, uncorked it once again, and neatly poured it into the glasses. The clear liquid splashed a bit in the glass before settling. A strong aroma filled the air. Mr. E took a deep breath and closed his eyes. His ears fluttered once again as he picked up the glass and took a sip.
Yes. Honey with a dash of pink roses, Mr. E said.
Ha! Quite a tongue you have there, my friend. Yes, there is indeed honey, and rose petals were part of the initial process, Carl said as he took a sip from his glass. Mr. E placed his drink down.
Now about the deal we had made, Carl. I spoke with your friend here and have agreed to negotiate the terms in the spirit of hospitality.
Oh, well, in the spirit of hospitality and friendship, let's relook at the old boy. What exactly did you do, Carl? Katina questioned. I played a few round of games with Mr. E here, and well, one thing led to another, and now I'm to marry his granddaughter, Carl said as he folded his hands together sheepishly. Games? Katina asked.
Yes, games. He was doing quite well up until the last game,
Mr. E said as he picked up his drink and took another sip. He lost?
Mr. E chuckled. No, my dear child, not quite. He cheated.
Katina blinked a few times and slowly turned her head towards Carl. You tried to cheat an Elder Fae? Katina asked. Carl raised his hands. You know how things go. One minute you got a good card and the next you don't, so you tipsy-turvy the scales in your favor. Yeah, that's called cheating. Mr. E chuckled and took another sip of his drink.
And therefore you were disqualified and lost the contest,
Mr. E said as he placed his glass down once more. Carl picked up the jug and poured some more of his brew into Mr. E's glass. All right, so we play another round of games then to even things out, Katina said. Carl raised his eyebrows and widened his eyes. Mr. E nodded as he picked up his glass and took another sip.
That sounds reasonable. The terms of the contest shall be as follows. 3 games, best of 3. No cheating. We play till the end, and the end result shall be the final decision. Carl, do you agree to these terms?
Mr. E asked. So if you win, it's business as usual with the wedding, but if I win, then I go free? Carl asked.
Well, it is somewhat of a repeat of our first round of games, but yes, you win, you go free. Free from my influence and free from any obligation you have with the Fae. But if I win, then you will continue to serve me and marry my granddaughter.
All right, Mr. E, you got a deal, Carl said as he held out his hand. Mr. E smiled and wrapped his long fingers around Carl's hand. A sudden hum filled the air as blue mist emitted from the handshake. Carl placed his elbow on the counter and rested his head on his hand. So, what games are we playing? Riddles in the dark? Carl asked with a cocky smile.
Oh, heavens no. Those types of games are for children. No. I figure we play some good old classic games, Mr. E said.
This better be safe, Katina said as she stared at Mr. E. Mr. E turned to her and gave a light smile.
Oh, my dear, I assure you they are, to those that are playing, Mr. E said.
Wait, what? Katina asked. But before she could react, Mr. E snapped his fingers, and suddenly the room grew dark. Carl stood in the darkness alone. The whole bar seemed to have disappeared all around him. He outstretched his hands and fumbled in the dark for a bit before a large spotlight burst into life and shone down on him. From behind him, Carl heard the sound of creaking wood. He turned around, and in front of him was a large wooden spinning wheel. The wheel had a bullseye painted on it, as well as a familiar friend strapped to the wheel. Oh, whoa, Carl said nervously as he looked at Katina strapped to the wheel, spinning in circles. Oh, you've got to be kidding me, Katina said in an annoyed tone as she went around and around on the wheel. Before Carl could properly react, Mr. E appeared from the shadows next to Carl and held up several knives.
I know you mortals love playing a game of darts, so I figured we'd play something similar to that, but with some stakes involved. And remember, you must hit the target and not your friend, Mr. E said.
Now hold up, you said that no one would get hurt, Carl said as he pointed towards Katina.
I said those that are playing will be safe. Your friend here is not playing, and thus free from my word, Mr. E said as he offered Carl a sharp knife. Shall you make the first toss, old friend?
Carl hesitated for a moment, but took the sharp knife from Mr. E's hand. He looked back at Katina, who was still spinning in circles on the dartboard. Carl, she started. This is really testing my patience, Katina said. Carl aimed the knife at the board. Okay, I got this, he whispered to himself and took a deep breath. He pulled back the knife and took a step forward before releasing it. Katina shut her eyes, grit her teeth, and turned her head away from Carl. The knife sailed through the air and punctured the dartboard right next to Katina's arm. Mr. E smiled. Katina let out a deep sigh of relief. Sweat started to form on her brow and on her wrists that were being held in place. She felt her heart jump and race.
Good toss, my friend. I believe that is 20 points to you, Mr. E said as he raised a knife and aimed it towards the board. Katina eyed the knife and clenched her fists, bracing. Mr. E didn't bring his arm back as he simply let the knife go, and the knife shot across the space and impaled itself right next to Katina's head. Katina let out a cry of panic.
Her eyes wandered over and stared at the knife that was only a few inches from her head.
"Oh, bad luck, old sport," Mr. E said. "That's 50 points for me. You're down by 30.
Carl bit his lip and suspirated. Mr. E reached into his robe and pulled out 2 short axes.
"Shall we increase the stakes?"
Carl eyed the axe warily. He looked back at Katina, who, though still spinning, clearly showed that she was rattled. Carl reached out and took one of the small axes. "All right, but since you are ahead, you go first," Carl said. Mr. E tilted his head and smiled.
"Ah, but since you are behind, it is merely sportsmanlike to let the losing opponent have the opportunity to catch up. Give it a toss when you are ready," Mr. E said.
Carl gulped as he raised the axe and aimed it towards Katina. "Whoa, what the fuck? Put down the goddamn axe!" Katina shouted.
"That's a bit unsportsmanlike behavior. I honestly should not be surprised," Mr. E said as he waved his hands toward Katina.
Katina soon found a thick silk red cloth slithering its way up her side and wrapping itself around her mouth. Katina writhed in place. Muffled shouting could be heard, but not understood. Carl flinched as the axe ever so slightly trembled in his hand. "Here we go again," he whispered to himself as he reeled back his arm and threw the axe. The axe gracefully tumbled through the air, and as it did, Carl gave a sly grin. The axe was heading towards the centerpiece near Katina's head. That would give him the most points and put him ahead of Mr. E. As the axe flew towards its target, it started to arc and fall. Carl's heart sank to the bottom of his stomach as he watched the axe drift downward from where he had aimed, and as Katina spun on the wheel, the axe hit a different target. A loud but muffled demonic scream echoed throughout the stage as the axe embedded itself into Katina's shoulder. Deep red blood leaked all over the board and onto the floor as Katina continued to spin in circles. Blood sprinkled her face and hair as Carl looked at the scene with a look of shock and terror. He felt his stomach turn as he watched Katina squirm and wiggle even more so. White, hot, intense pain flashed all over her body. Sweat poured from her forehead and down the back of her neck. She bit down on the piece of cloth that was covering her mouth with all of her frustration. Her cries of pain were muffled through the cloth, but Carl knew exactly what she was saying.
"Oh, that's rather unfortunate," Mr. E said in a nonchalant tone.
Carl didn't turn around. He simply dropped to his knees, never taking his eyes off of Katina as she writhed in pain.
"Well, since you hit your friend, that means this game goes to me,"
Mr. E said as the small axe in his hand disappeared.
"And since you have lost this game, you can pick the next one."
Carl let out a little chuckle as he bowed his head and closed his eyes. Carl stood up and faced Mr. E. "Dice," he said. "Let's play a game of dice. But first, please help Kat," Carl said with a hint of hesitation in his voice.
"Oh, of course, my dear boy,"
Mr. E said as he turned his head towards Katina, and with a wave of his hand, she and the board disappeared, only leaving the few sprinkles of blood on the floor. Carl turned to see an empty space where Katina and the board was. He quickly turned back to Mr. E.
"Relax, she is safe and well. And now on to our second game. A game of dice, as you put it,"
Mr. E said as he stomped his staff onto the ground, and suddenly the light overhead went out. Darkness and silence filled the spaces in between. The first thing that Carl noticed was the heavy air and the smell. It smelled of old rotten eggs. Then a faint red light started to slowly fill the area around him. And then the heat set in. It was boiling hot. Carl felt the heat radiating from his feet. More light came, and soon Carl realized where he was. The rocky wall stretched high into the abyss, and the surface he was standing on was a solid, tall piece of rock, and down below, about 100 feet, was a pool of glowing magma. Out in front of him was a long stone bridge, and on the bridge were colored squares. At the end of the bridge was another raised platform of solid rock and stone, and in the center Carl could see a little glass bottle sitting by itself in the center. Mr. E appeared from behind Carl. Carl turned to face him with a look of unease. "I asked for a game of dice," Carl said. Mr. E only smiled.
"That you did, and here they are,"
Mr. E said, as he presented a set of 6-sided dice in his hand to Carl.
"Here are the rules. We each take a turn of rolling a die. Whatever number you land on, you may move that many squares. There are 10 squares in total. The first one to reach the end wins. Should you pass another or land on the same platform, the person on that space must make a roll and go back that many squares. Oh, and careful not to fall off the bridge. It's quite a fall,"
Mr. E said with a smile. Carl took the die in hand and looked it over. It was a small 6-sided die made of bone with little indents in it representing the numbers. "Let me guess. I go first since I lost the last game?" Carl asked.
Mr. E nodded. "It would only be fair to give you a chance to catch up. After all, I am 1 game ahead of you," Mr. E said.
Carl sighed and walked up to the bridge, shook the die in his hand, and rolled it on the ground. The die rolled for a short distance before landing on a number. 6, Carl said with a smile as he eagerly scooped up the die and walked 6 squares on the bridge.
"Good toss," Mr. E said.
Mr. E then crouched down and rolled his die. A smile grew on his face as he looked back up at Carl.
6 as well,"
Mr. E said as he stood up and walked 6 squares over to Carl. Mr. E walked slowly over towards Carl and stood towering over him with his dark emerald eyes.
"As per the rules, you must now roll and move back,"
Mr. E reminded Carl. He grit his teeth as he shook the die in his hand. Carl inhaled deeply through his nose as he rolled the die on the ground, carefully making sure it didn't roll off the edge. The number 3 came up. Carl grunted as he picked up the die and walked 3 squares back.
"Is that all you have to say, old boy?" Mr. E asked as he furrowed his eyebrows. "No pitter-patter? No words of confidence or bravado?"
"Just roll," Carl said coldly.
"Such a poor sport,"
Mr. E said as he crouched down and rolled his die. His ears flopped down as the number came up.
1, he said to himself as he stood up and walked 1 square ahead.
Carl crouched down on his square and started rapidly shaking his die between his hands. "Come on, I need a bit of luck here," he whispered to himself. He cast the die on the ground. It tumbled a bit before landing on a number. Carl's heart leaped with joy. 5, he said as a smile shined on his face. Carl picked his die up and proudly walked 5 squares ahead. He was now 1 square ahead of Mr. E. Carl spun around on his heel. Oh, what was it you said about passing another player on the bridge? I feel like there was a rule about that, Carl said with a cocky grin. Mr. E only smiled back.
"Now there's the spirit I know. Correct, dear boy. I shall make my roll,"
Mr. E said as he crouched down and rolled his die.
3,
he said as he stood up and walked 3 squares back. Carl looked towards the end of the bridge, and he could now see the little bottle in the center much more clearly. There appeared to be a little figure inside the bottle. Oh, he said to himself as he raised his eyebrows. Carl shook the die in his hand. There were only 2 squares in front of him before the end of the bridge. He rolled the die. 2, he said as he picked up his die and walked 2 more squares. 1 more roll, and he would make it, unless something were to happen. Mr. E gave a soft smile as he crouched down and rolled his die. It rolled on the dirt, revealing the number 5. Mr. E walked 5 squares ahead and stood behind Carl.
"Mighty fine game, old boy, but I do believe you are to win this,"
Mr. E said as he stood next to Carl. Carl grinned and shook the die once more. He carelessly leaned his head back with a confident smile and released it from his hand in the air. The die fell towards the ground, bounced, and rolled towards the edge of the bridge. Carl's heart sank as it slid close to the edge and stopped. His eyes glued to the number facing upwards, peppered with the thought of what might have happened should the die have gone over the edge.
Pride almost got you there, Mr. E said. Anyway, I believe that's a 2, Mr. E said as he pointed at the die. Congratulations.
Carl shook off the anxiety that was creeping up his spine and turning his legs into noodles, and walked off the bridge and up to the bottle. Inside the bottle was a small figure. They were sitting in the center, looking completely bored. Carl picked up the bottle, and the figure tumbled and stood up. "Carl, you idiot!" Katina called out from inside the bottle. Her voice sounded soft and tinny. She was no more than a few inches tall, and still looked as mad as ever. There didn't appear to be any wound on her shoulder, or any blood. Mr. E approached from behind Carl and grinned.
See, old boy? Safe and well, as I said, Mr. E said.
Carl turned around, still holding the bottle in his hand. "All right, you kept your word. Now let her go," Carl said as he held up the bottle. Katina stood inside the bottle, taking slow, deep breaths while staring up at Mr. E with a disgruntled, sour look on her face.
Oh, not right now, my dear boy. I still have plans for her to be safe and well for our last game.
Carl sighed. And what is our last game? We're tied now. Mr. E leaned over on his staff with a smile.
Yes, we are. The tension is certainly brewing here, just like the batch you served earlier in the evening. Since I lost this round, the choice falls onto me to pick the last game, and I choose a lovely game of cards, Mr. E said as he raised his hand and snapped his fingers. Everything went dark once again. Soon, the bottle in Carl's hand was gone, and in the darkness, he noticed the air around him suddenly was cool and damp. The smell of seawater soon filled his nostrils, and his footing started to wobble. Light shined down from above, accompanied with the sound of roaring waves. Carl stumbled even more as he felt the ground beneath him shake and turn. He looked around, and as the light coated the area, he realized he was on a ship in the middle of the ocean, a schooner. The stars and moon above painted the night sky. The loud roar of the waters soon sent shivers up his spine as the light dimmed for a second, and a wave came crashing in, knocking him down to the wooden floor. Rain started to pour down, first in light drops, then heavy. The drops felt like little pebbles hitting him all over his body as he laid on the deck, soaking wet. The boat rocked once more, and Carl rolled over along with it, colliding into the railing. And then he heard a voice over the sound of waves and wind. Tom will to his parents, Jack will to his dear, Joe to wife and children, Bob to pipe and beer, Dickie to the dancing room to hear the fiddles play, round the world and home again, that's the sailor's way, sang a familiar voice.
Carl looked up to see Mr. E behind the helm of the ship. With his long fingers wrapped around the wheel, he looked down at Carl with a mischievous grin.
Welcome aboard, lad, Mr. E said as he let go of the wheel. I do enjoy a nice outing, he said as the waves smashed into the side of the boat.
Carl stumbled to the side, but Mr. E appeared to not be affected by the turbulence. He simply walked over to Carl without any issues and offered his hand.
One more game, old boy, and then we will have our conclusion to these matters.
Carl reached out and took Mr. E's hand and hoisted himself up on his feet. And we're to play a game in the middle of a storm? Carl asked.
Spot on, old friend. Yes, I figure after the second game in the volcano, a change of scenery was necessary. Something a little cooler and wet, Mr. E said.
Carl dropped his shoulders and looked around. I
don't see any tables or chairs or cards for that matter, Carl said. Mr. E waved his hand, and instantly in the center of the deck was a table with 2 chairs. Carl looked over at the chairs. Despite the boat rocking and the rain coming down, the table and chairs seemed to be unaffected. Carl looked back up at Mr. E, who at this point was holding out a deck of cards.
I'm a fan of the classics. I figured we should play a nice game of Old Maid. I assume you know the rules, Mr. E said.
Carl smiled. Depends. Are they the rules I would know, or are there rules that you have added?
Oh, don't be such a spoil-sport. I wasn't the one cheating in our last card game. I am very upfront about the rules of the game. But, seeing your skepticism, we are each given half of the deck of cards and make pairs. One of the cards in the deck has the Old Maid. The goal is to get rid of your hand by making as many pairs as you can without being left with the Old Maid. If you are left with the Old Maid in your hand, you lose. Ready to play? Mr. E said.
The 2 sat down at the table. The area was surprisingly warm and calm, despite the storm around them. The wind, rain, or even the waves didn't appear to affect either of them as they sat at the table. Mr. E dealt out the cards to Carl and to himself. Carl examined the cards in his hand. The 2 spent a moment, making as many pairs as they could with what they had in their hand, leaving them with what remained. As Carl shuffled his hand a bit, making sure there were no more pairs, his heart sank. The Old Maid was in his hand. He looked back up at Mr. E, who continued to wear his puckish smile that he'd been sporting since the beginning of the game. Carl held out his cards towards Mr. E. Mr. E reached out his hand. His long fingers danced in the air over the cards. Mr. E took a card, but it was not the Old Maid, and he made another pair and placed it on the table. Carl quickly counted. He had 10 cards left in his hand, while Mr. E only had 8. Carl took a breath and reached out towards Mr. E's cards and selected one. As he brought it over, his eyes widened. The card he picked was the Queen of Clubs, and in the center of the card was Katina sitting on a throne in a queen's outfit, looking very disgruntled. She looked up at Carl and tried to speak, but nothing came out. Carl quickly shuffled her around in his hand. No new pairs. Katina seemed to be affected by the motion of the cards as she swayed back and forth in her chair.
I see you found her,
Mr. E said with a sly smile as he reached out and pulled another card from Carl's hand. Fitting, Carl commented.
Indeed,
Mr. E said as he made another pair and placed it on the table. Carl was at 10, and Mr. E was now down to 6 cards. Carl reached over and snatched a card out of Mr. E's hand and finally made a pair. Mr. E reached out. His fingers wiggled a bit in the air as he slowly came down. Carl kept a still expression as Mr. E's fingers lightly tapped the Old Maid card and retrieved it from his hand. Mr. E's ears drooped a bit as he looked at the card. He quickly shuffled the cards in his hand and presented them to Carl. Carl reached out. His heart was pounding and his mind was racing. He didn't see where Mr. E could have placed the card. He had to take a chance. Finally, his finger landed on a card on the side and pulled it. His heart leaped and his shoulders felt a release. It was a Queen of Spades, and he paired it with Katina's card and placed them both on the table. The game continued like this for a few minutes, always dreading the return of the Old Maid and the ever-so-slow dwindle of the cards in their hands. The Old Maid being passed back to Carl and then back to Mr. E kept the game lively and tense. As the rain continued to come down around them, the waters of the ocean poured in over the railing and soaked their feet. The game was nearing the end. Carl had 1 card left in his hand, and Mr. E only had 2. Carl stared at the 2 cards. One would give him the out he needed, and the other would enslave him for the rest of his days. He couldn't barter his way out of this. His eyes danced back and forth, trying to figure out which card to pick. He took a deep breath and lowered his eyes to the table.
The game hadn't been going on long, but it certainly felt like an eternity already. Carl shifted his eyes over the table and landed on Katina, who had been staring at him intensely for the past few turns. She then started to wave her little hands at Carl. She could only communicate with gestures. She pointed at her eyes and then back at Carl. And then she tugged on her ear. Eyes again, and then her ear. Carl looked at her curiously, and suddenly, an idea came to him. Carl steeled his emotions. He had an idea, a clever idea, and if it worked, it would save him. He reached out with his hand and let his fingers dance over the two cards. But it wasn't the cards he was looking at. It was Mr. E's eyes. In that instant, Carl knew which card to pick. The two of diamonds shone brightly under the pale moonlight as he placed it in his hand and then onto the table with his final remaining card. Mr. E's ears slumped again as he stared at the lone old maid card in his hand. He looked up at Carl with a smile.
Good game, old chap. You won, Mr. E said.
The rain started to lift. The clouds above slowly parted and sunlight broke over the horizon and shined onto Carl's face. The ocean calmed down as Mr. E stood up from the table. Carl's arms felt like loose, wet noodles as he leaned back in his chair. He wasn't aware of how heavy his clothes had felt after weathering through the storm. He looked up at Mr. E, who was looking down at him with a smile on his face.
I very much enjoyed our time together, Carl. I do hope we can play again sometime. But I feel that our time together has drawn to a close,
Mr. E said, as he slightly bowed his head while leaning on his staff.
The day is yours. Enjoy it,
Mr. E said as he started to walk away from the table. The table suddenly erupted and shook as Katina burst from the card she was in, causing Carl to fall back from his chair and onto the deck with a thud and a splash. Katina landed on top of the table and rolled onto the deck. "Carl?" she said in a groggy voice. Carl rolled over and sat up. "Cat. Hi," Carl said nervously. Katina stood up, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath.
Temper there, Hellspawn, Mr. E said.
Katina looked at Mr. E with a hint of yellow in her eyes. Katina closed her eyes again and took another deep breath. "Let's go home already," she finally said. Mr. E gave a small chuckle as he lightly tapped the deck of the ship with his staff. The wind started to blow up again, carrying leaves of green, yellow, and salt water. In a flash, the world around Carl and Katina had blurred, sunk and swallowed, only to stretch out and back to normal. When their vision cleared, they were standing right back in the tavern, where everything had begun. The patrons of the tavern were still passed out, fast asleep, all but Charles, who was still sitting there at the bar with a now empty bottle of wine sitting in front of him. Charles looked up at the two and gave a weak, drunken smile. "You're back, Kay," Charles said, as he pointed at the empty wine bottle with his glass. "I think I sprang a leak. It's all gone." Katina breathed a sigh of relief. "Yes, Charles. It looks like there was a leak." "Hey, Cat?" Carl started. Katina looked at him with a tired expression. "Thanks," Carl said, with a genuine smile of gratitude. He rubbed the back of his head nervously. "You're not still mad at me, are you?" Carl asked as he cupped his hands together, tapping his fingers. "Oh, I am pissed. I won't lie about that," Katina said. "But I'm not going to hit you, though I should. You made a deal with an Elder Fae. You cheated at the first game? And for what? Why did you play against him in the first place?" Carl raised his hands defensively. "Hey, it's not like I wanted to play against him originally. In fact, it didn't start with him. It started with those stupid sprites in my apartment. I hit them with some pest spray after they were causing me such a ruckus, and then they called the big guy." There was a brief moment of silence between the two, before Katina slapped Carl across the face. "You deserve that," she said coldly. Carl placed his hand on his cheek and rubbed it with a guilty look on his face. Carl took a few steps back towards the entrance and looked around at the sleeping patrons on the floor and tables. So, are you banning me from here? Carl asked. Katina closed her eyes, pinched the brow of her nose, and sighed heavily. No. You're not banned from here, but you're not allowed to bring your own booze anymore, or make any deals with the Fae while in this establishment, she said as she leaned on the counter. Ha, deal, Carl said with a devilish grin as he turned around and ran out the entrance, hopping over the people still on the ground. That kid is going to be the death of me one day, Katina said as she started to look around at the tavern. She looked back at Charles, who at this point had slumped on top of the counter and fallen asleep. All right, cleanup time, she said to herself as she walked over to the shelf. She reached up and grabbed a somewhat empty bottle, and with a spoon she started clinking rapidly. All right, everyone up, she shouted as she continued clinking the glass. Some of the patrons slowly stirred and began opening their eyes. Come on, people. Wake up. We got a gas leak here. I need everyone out right away, Katina called out. The people on the floor started to raise their heads at the noise. Many looked around confused and motioned the others around them to wake up. Slowly, people stood up and in a daze shuffled themselves towards the exit. The tavern soon became empty. Then there came a frantic cry and shuffling from the back room. The door soon burst open, and two figures scurried their way towards the exit, dressed in their dark cloaks, while a third figure followed behind them, draped in a thin white cloth. Katina moved around the tavern, checking to see if anyone else was asleep anywhere else. When she stumbled into the woman's bathroom, she heard a slight snoring sound. Towards the end of the last bathroom stall was Evelyn, passed out on the floor near the toilet with a small puddle of orange vomit next to her. The smell was enough to peel paint off the walls. Katina tapped her on the shoulder, and when that didn't work, she reached out and grabbed Evelyn by her ankles and slowly dragged her out of the stall. Katina dragged Evelyn back into the tavern and lifted her up onto her shoulders and carried her towards the back room. Goddamn college kids, she mumbled to herself as she placed Evelyn on the couch. She walked back out into the tavern once again and slowly closed the door to the back room. As she walked back towards the bar, she surveyed the area. Not too bad, a few toppled chairs and some drinks spilled. Nothing that a quick cleaning couldn't solve. It could have been worse. As Katina went behind the counter, fetching the red bucket and cloth, she soon heard footsteps. She poked her head up, and in front of her was an older gentleman. He had white hair and a little goatee. He wore a white suit with a red bow tie and a straw boater hat on his head. He looked at Katina with deep emerald green eyes and a small smile.
Pardon me, good barkeep. I do hope I am not intruding upon your humble abode, but I was in the area and fancied myself a drink, as I am quite parched, the old gentleman said politely.
Katina looked at the gentleman, squinted her eyes, and placed the bucket back on the ground. I am sorry, sir, but we have had a bit of a nasty gas leak in the area. Most of the other patrons, for their safety, have left, and I am in need to get the place checked out. The gentleman sat on the bar stool and looked around.
I do see that. But in that case, if you don't mind, I would like to have one last taste of that brew our dear friend Carl had made, if it is still around.
Katina let out a sigh and dipped her head a bit before lifting it back up at the gentleman with a courteous smile. I do believe I can do that for you, good sir. And how will you be paying for this drink? Katina said as she picked up a glass from behind the bar and placed it in front of the old gentleman. The old gentleman smiled.
I can trade you for it, he said as he reached into his coat pocket.
From his pocket, he pulled out a small axe with a tiny dark red bloodstain on it and placed it on the counter.
You can have either the axe that hit you,
he said as he reached back into his coat pocket. Katina stood there looking very unamused at the sight. The old gentleman placed a bottle on the counter next to the axe.
The bottle that housed you.
He reached into his coat pocket one last time and pulled out a blank card.
Or you can have the card that trapped you,
he said as he placed the blank card onto the counter. Katina stared at the items on the table. Gee, what prizes to choose from, she said as she placed her hands on her hips. And all from our fun little games that I was brought along for. Such fun, Katina said, her words bleeding with sarcasm. The old gentleman smiled and chuckled to himself.
Sharp as expected, he said. I can see why Carl ran here when I came to collect him. He was wise to trust you, Mr. E said.
He's more an idiot than anything.
Oh, most certainly. He doesn't understand the world as we do. I figured he would make a good husband for my granddaughter, but alas, I'll have to find another.
Why are you so keen on finding someone for your granddaughter anyway? Katina asked. Mr. E waved his hand in the air.
Ah, poor child fell in love with a mortal man some time ago in the past. Got him running around, playing little games with her. He played her games, won, and ran off. And now she's been smitten with him and won't stop looking, Mr. E said.
I see. Well, if we are trading one for one here, I will trade you a drink of Carl's nightmare brew for this one, Katina said as she pointed at the bottle.
A wise choice, Mr. E said as he moved the bottle closer to Katina. Do be careful when opening it. You never know what will come out, Mr. E said with a devilish grin.
This has been Dealbreaker, a Tavern Tale story, written by Samantha Flanagan, copyright 2025. Narrated by Stephen Ragsdale in partnership with Patron Muse Studios, copyright 2026. We hope you enjoyed listening.